This black family posed happily in 1948, until a detail revealed where they weren't allowed to go. Margaret Hayes stood in the climate-controlled archive room of the Atlanta History Center, her gloved hands carefully holding a faded photograph. As a documentary researcher specializing in the civil rights era, she had examined thousands of images over her 15-year career. But something about this one stopped her cold. The photograph showed a well-dressed African-American family of 4, frozen in time outside an ornate park gate in 1948. Their smiles were genuine, their clothing immaculate. The father's fedora sat at a proud angle. The mother's white gloves gleamed even in the aged photograph. 2 children beamed at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of youth. Margaret had initially passed over this image during her morning cataloging. It seemed like just another family portrait from the post-war era, pleasant but unremarkable among the hundreds she processed each week. However, something nagged at her, an instinct developed over years of archival work. A sense that photographs sometimes held secrets in their margins, in their backgrounds, in the details that went unnoticed at first glance. She returned to the photograph after lunch, this time examining it under the magnifying glass mounted on her desk. The late afternoon sun, streaming through the archive windows, caught the image at a different angle, illuminating details that had been obscured in the morning light. That's when she saw it. Behind the family, partially obscured by the overhanging branch of an oak tree, was a metal sign. Margaret adjusted the magnifying glass, leaning closer, her breath catching in her throat. The words were weathered but legible. Whites only. City Ordinance, 1923. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her digital camera, documenting what she had found. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was documentation. This was testimony. This was resistance captured on film. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing with questions. Who were these people? Why had they chosen to photograph themselves at this particular location? What had motivated them to pose so deliberately, so proudly, outside a place that explicitly excluded them? And most importantly, what had happened to them? Had they survived to see the world change? Margaret photographed the image from multiple angles, capturing every detail under different lighting conditions. The park gates featured distinctive ironwork, curling vines and magnolia blossoms wrought in iron that would help identify the specific location. She uploaded the high-resolution images to her computer and began the methodical process of cross-referencing them with historical records of Atlanta parks from the 1940s. The Segregation Ordinance number 1923 gave her a crucial starting point for her research. Within an hour of intense searching through digital archives, she had identified the location, Piedmont Park's eastern entrance, which had been redesigned and upgraded in 1935 as part of a Depression-era public works project. The ornate gates matched archival photographs from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's extensive collection. Margaret pulled up city directories from 1948, searching for African-American families who lived near the park boundaries. The list was surprisingly long. Despite the harsh segregation laws, many black families had established homes in the surrounding neighborhoods, though they couldn't access the park's amenities, playgrounds, or green spaces that were so close to their daily lives. She contacted her colleague, Dr. Robert Chen, a historian specializing in Jim Crow Atlanta and its legal apparatus. "Robert, I need you to see something immediately," she said into her phone, unable to contain the excitement and urgency in her voice. Within 20 minutes, he was standing beside her desk in the archive room, studying the photograph through the magnifying glass with the careful attention of a trained historian. "This is deliberate," Robert said quietly, tracing the composition with his finger hovering carefully above the delicate image without touching it. "Look at how they're positioned. The gate is clearly visible in the frame. The sign is partially shown, but readable. The family is centered perfectly. This wasn't accidental or a casual snapshot." He straightened up, meeting Margaret's eyes with growing excitement. Someone wanted to document this specific moment, this specific exclusion. The question is why? What were they trying to preserve? Margaret nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "I'm thinking this might not be an isolated photograph. What if there are more? What if this was part of something larger?" Margaret spent the next 3 days systematically combing through the History Center's uncatalogued collections, working late into the evenings when the building was quiet and empty. The photograph had been part of a donated estate, acquired 6 months earlier from a deceased woman named Dorothy Patterson. The donation records were frustratingly sparse, just basic information about boxes of miscellaneous items, family papers, and photographs that hadn't yet been properly inventoried, cataloged, or preserved according to archival standards. She formally requested access to the entire Patterson donation. 2 archivists wheeled out 3 large archival boxes on a cart, each one labeled with temporary identification numbers. Margaret's heart raced with anticipation as she carefully opened the first one, not knowing what she might discover. Inside were letters, receipts, church programs, school reports, and various ephemera spanning several decades. The second box contained more photographs. Birthday parties, weddings, church gatherings, school graduations, normal family memories, precious but seemingly ordinary. The third box was different, fundamentally different. Wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue paper were 43 photographs, each one meticulously preserved in individual glass sign envelopes with archival quality materials. Margaret's hands shook as she laid them out on the large archive table in careful rows. Each photograph showed the same family, the father, mother, and 2 children, posed in front of different locations around Atlanta. A movie theater with a prominent colored entrance rear sign directing black patrons to a separate door. A drinking fountain marked white, with a smaller, poorly maintained fountain labeled colored beside it. A pristine public library with a separate, notably smaller building behind it for black residents. Every photograph was dated on the back in careful, precise handwriting. July 1946, September 1947, March 1948. Each location was meticulously noted. Fox Theater, Courthouse Square, Carnegie Library, and each included a brief, heartbreaking notation. Where we cannot go, where Sarah cannot drink, where James cannot read. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. This wasn't just a collection of family photographs. This was a systematic, deliberate documentation of segregation, created by an ordinary family who somehow understood that someday someone would need to see the truth they had lived. Margaret needed to know more about Dorothy Patterson and her connection to the family in the photographs. The donation papers listed her last known address, a modest single-story house in the West End neighborhood, a historically black area of Atlanta. Margaret drove there on a cool October morning, the autumn air crisp and clear, hoping to find neighbors who might have known Dorothy or remembered her. The house stood empty and neglected, a faded "For Sale" sign planted in the overgrown front yard. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the porch sagged slightly. Margaret felt a pang of sadness looking at it. She knocked on the door of the neighboring house, a well-maintained home with flower boxes in the windows. An elderly woman answered, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a floral apron. "Can I help you, dear? I'm Margaret Hayes from the Atlanta History Center. I'm researching a collection of photographs that were donated by Dorothy Patterson, who I believe lived next door. Did you know her?" Margaret asked hopefully. The woman's weathered face softened immediately with recognition and fondness. "Dorothy? Oh, yes. She was my neighbor for 30 years. Sweet woman, quiet and dignified, passed away last spring after a brief illness. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Gibson and opened the door wider. Would you like to come in? I have some time, and I'd be happy to talk about Dorothy. She was a good friend." Over coffee in Eleanor's warm, comfortable kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread, Margaret learned that Dorothy had been a retired school teacher who had dedicated 40 years to educating children in Atlanta's segregated and then integrated schools. She had been quiet and intensely private, never married, never had children of her own. But she loved talking about her family history, Eleanor said, stirring sugar into her coffee. She was especially proud of her aunt and uncle, said they were brave people who stood up in their own way during the difficult years. She said they did something important that people should remember. Margaret's pulse quickened with anticipation. "Do you remember their names?" Eleanor thought for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. "Sarah and James. I remember because Dorothy talked about them so often, especially in her final years. Sarah was her father's sister, which made her Dorothy's aunt. Dorothy said they did something important during the segregation years, something people should know about, but that had been forgotten." She paused, setting down her coffee cup carefully. Dorothy spent her last months organizing all those old family papers and photographs. She was quite deliberate about it, going through everything methodically. She told me once that it was time for the story to be told, that she wouldn't live forever and someone needed to preserve what her family had done. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Dorothy had known the value of what she possessed. She had understood its historical significance and had made sure it would survive her, that it would find its way to people who would recognize its importance and share it with the world. Back at the archive that afternoon, Margaret searched through the rest of Dorothy's papers with renewed focus and purpose. In a manila envelope at the very bottom of the third box, buried under layers of other documents, she found what she was looking for, a family tree meticulously drawn in Dorothy's careful handwriting. At the top of the tree were 2 names, Sarah Mitchell, born 1918, and James Mitchell, born 1915. Their children were listed below, Ruth Mitchell, born 1940, and Thomas Mitchell, born 1943. Dorothy had documented everything. Margaret's research intensified over the following days. She found James Mitchell's name in the 1948 Atlanta City Directory. Mitchell, James, Porter, Terminal Station. He had worked at Atlanta's main train station, a grueling job that required long hours of physical labor and paid modest wages. Sarah Mitchell didn't appear in the directory, which likely meant she was either a domestic worker in white homes or stayed home with the children. Neither occupation was typically listed in official directories of the era. She discovered Ruth Mitchell's obituary from 2003 in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution archives. Ruth had died at 63 from heart disease, survived by 2 daughters, Patricia Collins and Dorothy Patterson. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Dorothy wasn't just a distant relative preserving family history. She was Sarah and James's granddaughter. The photographs had been taken by her own grandparents. This was her direct family legacy, her inheritance of memory and resistance. Among Dorothy's carefully preserved papers, Margaret found a letter that changed everything and revealed the true depth of what Sarah and James had done. It was written by Sarah Mitchell to her daughter Ruth in 1968, shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., during one of the darkest moments in civil rights history. The letter was typed on thin onion-skin paper, the kind used to save money in paper, folded carefully along its original creases, and preserved in a protective plastic sleeve that Dorothy had added years later. "My dear Ruth," it began in Sarah's formal but warm style, "in these dark days, as our city and our nation mourn, I find myself thinking about the photographs your father and I took 20 years ago. You were just a child then, only 8 years old, and Tommy was barely more than a baby at 5. You asked me once, I remember, why we dressed in our Sunday best to stand outside places we couldn't enter, why we smiled for the camera in front of signs that denied our humanity and told us we were not welcome. Why we subjected you children to those moments when we could have simply stayed home and avoided the painful reminders of our exclusion. I want you to understand now that you're grown and raising your own daughters. Your father and I knew that words could be dismissed as exaggeration or bitterness. Memories could fade with time or be questioned by those who weren't there. Stories could be denied by people who preferred not to believe the truth of how things were. But photographs don't lie. Photographs are evidence that can't be argued away or dismissed as subjective memory. We wanted to create a record that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren could see with their own eyes. We wanted proof for the future. For you, for your children, for anyone who might one day say, it wasn't that bad, or that didn't really happen, or those stories are exaggerated. We wanted evidence that would outlast us and testify to the truth long after we were gone. The letter continued, detailing their methodology and their hopes. Margaret read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face, understanding finally the full scope of what this family had done and why they had done it. Margaret and Robert began researching whether Sarah and James's photographic project was unique in the landscape of civil rights documentation. They discovered that, while many African Americans had documented segregation through photography during the Jim Crow era, few had done so as systematically or with such clearly articulated intent for future historical preservation. Gordon Parks, the famous photographer and filmmaker, had created powerful images of segregation that shocked the nation. But he was a professional with access to major publications and institutional support. Sarah and James were ordinary working people with limited resources, creating a private archive for an unknown future audience, with no guarantee that anyone would ever see or value their work. They were activists, Robert said, during one of their late-night research sessions in the archive, surrounded by spread documents and reference books. Not in the traditional sense. They didn't march in the streets, or organize protests, or join formal civil rights organizations, but they understood the power of documentation in a way that was remarkably sophisticated. They knew that bearing witness, that creating evidence, was its own form of resistance against erasure and denial. Margaret found records showing that James had been questioned by police in 1949 after being seen photographing the colored waiting room at Terminal Station, the very place where he worked as a porter. A brief police report, filed away in dusty records, noted, "Colored male taking pictures in station." Claimed it was for family memories. Sent him on his way with a warning not to cause trouble. The casual language in the report couldn't hide the underlying threat. James had been taking a significant risk every time he raised that camera in public spaces. They discovered through letters that Sarah had been fired from a domestic position in 1948, after her employer discovered she was photographing segregated facilities around the city. According to a letter Sarah wrote to her sister, preserved in Dorothy's papers, the employer had said, "I won't have someone working in my home who's trying to stir up trouble and make white people look bad." Sarah had been unemployed for 3 difficult months before finding another position, and the family had struggled financially during that period. The photographs had cost them dearly in practical terms. Margaret managed to locate Patricia Collins, Ruth's surviving daughter and Dorothy's sister, living in a comfortable retirement community in Decatur, just outside Atlanta. Patricia was 78 years old, sharp-minded and energetic, and eager to talk about her grandparents when Margaret called and explained her research. They arranged to meet the following Saturday. They sat together in Patricia's sunny apartment, surrounded by family photographs covering every available surface: weddings, graduations, holidays, babies. "I remember them very well," Patricia said warmly, pointing to a framed photograph of Sarah and James in their later years, probably from the 1970s. Grandma Sarah was dignified and quiet, always composed. She had this way of carrying herself that commanded respect without saying a word. Grandpa James had this way of looking at the world like he was always thinking, always observing and analyzing everything around him. My mother used to say he saw things other people missed. Patricia shared vivid memories from her childhood visits to her grandparents' home. Grandma kept those photographs in a special wooden trunk in her bedroom, locked with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck. Sometimes, when we visited, she'd take them out carefully and tell us stories about each location. She'd hold up a photograph and say, "This is the Fox Theater, where your mother couldn't watch movies with white children her own age. This is where I couldn't use the library, even though I loved to read more than anything. This is where your grandfather couldn't sit down to eat a meal, even though he worked there every day." She wanted us to know what they had lived through. "Did they ever talk explicitly about why they took the photographs?" Margaret asked, leaning forward with intense interest. Patricia nodded slowly, her eyes distant with memory. "Grandpa James told me once, when I was about 12 years old and asking questions about the civil rights movement, that they wanted us to know our real history, not the sanitized version. He said, The people who write the history books might forget or might lie about how bad it was, but these photographs can't lie. They show exactly how it was, what we faced every single day. He made me promise to keep them safe and to make sure they were never thrown away or forgotten. Margaret spent 3 months organizing a comprehensive exhibition at the Atlanta History Center titled Bearing Witness, The Mitchell Family's Photographic Record of Segregation, 1946-1950. She worked closely with Patricia Collins and other family members to ensure the story was told accurately and respectfully. The opening night drew hundreds of people. Historians, civil rights veterans, students, educators, Atlanta residents who wanted to see their city's difficult past, acknowledged honestly, and descendants of other families who had lived through the same era. The photographs were displayed chronologically along the walls, each one accompanied by Sarah's handwritten notes from the back of the originals, enlarged so visitors could read them clearly. Contextual information panels explained the specific segregation laws that governed each location shown in the photographs. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the original Piedmont Park photograph that had started Margaret's entire investigation, displayed in a prominent position alongside Sarah's powerful 1968 letter to Ruth, printed in full so visitors could read Sarah's own explanation of why the photographs mattered. Patricia Collins spoke at the opening reception, her voice strong and clear despite her age and the emotion of the moment. My grandparents didn't think of themselves as heroes or activists, she told the crowded room. They were ordinary people who did what they felt was necessary to preserve the truth. They wore their best clothes and smiled in those photographs because they refused to let segregation steal their dignity or diminish their humanity. They documented injustice systematically, but they also documented their own worth, their own beauty, their own unshakable sense of self. Local news covered the exhibition extensively. National media picked up the story within days. Within 2 weeks, the Mitchell family photographs were being discussed in classrooms, museums, and academic conferences across the country. Historians noted that while segregation had been photographed extensively by journalists, documentarians, and civil rights activists, the Mitchell collection was unique in its perspective. A black family systematically documenting their own exclusion over multiple years, creating an archive with the explicit intention of historical preservation for future generations who might otherwise forget or deny what had happened. The Atlanta City Council passed a unanimous resolution honoring Sarah and James Mitchell for their contribution to civil rights history and to the city's understanding of its own past. 6 months after the exhibition opened to overwhelming public response, Margaret stood once again in front of the Piedmont Park gates, but this time she wasn't alone in a quiet archive. Patricia Collins stood beside her, along with Ruth's other descendants, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of Sarah and James, who had never known about the photographs until Margaret's discovery brought them to light. It was a warm spring morning, and the park was alive with families, children playing, people of all backgrounds enjoying the space together. The new historical marker had been unveiled that morning in a ceremony attended by city officials, historians, and community members. It read, "Here in 1948, Sarah and James Mitchell photographed their family outside gates they could not enter due to segregation laws. Their systematic documentation of 43 segregated facilities in Atlanta between 1946 and 1950 created a powerful historical record of both injustice and dignity. This site represents one location in their remarkable project of bearing witness, ensuring that future generations would know the truth of what they endured and overcome." Patricia placed a bouquet of fresh flowers at the base of the marker, her hands trembling slightly. "They would be amazed by all this attention and recognition," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "They never sought fame or recognition. They just wanted people to remember accurately. They wanted the truth preserved so it couldn't be denied or diminished. They wanted their grandchildren to know what they had survived and to understand the value of the freedom they would inherit." Margaret had arranged for all 43 photographs to be professionally digitized at the highest possible resolution and made freely available online through the Library of Congress's digital collections. Students, researchers, educators, and anyone interested could now access the Mitchell family's complete archive from anywhere in the world. Several universities had already incorporated the collection into their curricula for courses on civil rights history, documentary photography, and African American studies. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd slowly dispersed, Margaret thought about Dorothy Patterson, who had spent her final months carefully organizing and preserving these photographs, ensuring they would survive and find their way to people who would understand their value. She thought about Ruth and Thomas, who had preserved their parents' legacy through their own lives. Most of all, she thought about Sarah and James Mitchell,